everybody, how's it going? Corey here from Themeco with a quick video on the post elements. Now before we get started, I want to take a moment to talk about the technology that powers these post elements, which we call loopers. Now all a looper is a way for you to get information from your WordPress install and then output it to the front of your site. The really cool thing about loopers is that they can be applied to any element that you're working on. So to see how that would work, we would click on this column, for example, go to Customize, and then at the bottom of your inspector, you'll see this Looper Provider and Looper Consumer option. Enabling a provider on an element allows us to turn on a WordPress query and access data in our database. So say you want the 6 most recent posts from your blog, or perhaps you want 4 products in your shop that belong to a specific category. There's all sorts of complex queries we can do here, but we're going to keep things very simple for today with recent posts. Next, we have our consumer, which when enabled acts as a model for us to style out our content and be looped over with the data given by the provider. Again, there's going to be some more videos on loopers in much greater detail later on. I just wanted to touch on that a little bit as we will be discussing it as we break these elements down in this video today. So let's get started by opening our elements library, searching for posts, and I'm going to drag in this minimal option first. So here's our minimal post element. And you'll remember from what I mentioned earlier that any element can be turned into a provider or a consumer. We're already seeing that firsthand here with this red observer here in the live preview area. If I go to my outline and find that post element, you'll see when I inspect it that it's really just a row element, which we have enabled our looper provider on. So anytime you see red as an observer in the live preview, think looper provider. There's a new query being used here and a specific set of data that I'm working with. In this particular instance, this is also where we're setting the count that we're getting here on the page. You'll notice I've got 6 posts being output, and that has been specified here. Now, we could use the default post per page number used in our WordPress settings in the admin. However, that number is typically used for your blog index or category archives as a whole. So when pulling in a specific set of data using a provider, we often recommend that you set that number to only the data you need so that you keep it as small as possible. You'll also notice a little repeating icon to the left of the label in the observer. That is our looper icon. So anywhere you see that, you'll know that a looper is being used. And if the observer is red, we know that as a provider. And if the observer is yellow with that looper icon next to the label, we know that that is a looper consumer. So let's inspect this column, which we've just renamed to post. And you can see when I go to customize here, I've turned on our looper consumer and I'm pulling in all of the items given by that provider from the row. So now that we've gotten some of that technical stuff out of the way, let's take a moment to inspect this post element. You'll notice as I move my mouse around here, all of the items within this element are inspectable, just like a normal element would be. And that is because each of the pieces of this particular post element are made up of actual elements in our element library. So for example, this title element is powered by our headline, and this bit of text is powered by our text element. And since each of these pieces are just elements on the page, that means we can inspect any piece we want and adjust it as we see fit. So for example, if you liked everything about this element, but you said, I really want this title to be a little bit bigger, we could come over here, make our adjustment, and you'll see that every post throughout that list now has that larger title applied to it. Let's take that back to 1. And now let's look at something like our excerpt. Let's say that we really like the style of this. However, we wanted the color to be a little bit darker. We can adjust that and get it just how we like. So I hope you're starting to see that this is not just another element with some hard-coded markup and options that you have to kind of force into your design. These are actual elements that can be moved around, adjusted, inspected exactly how you like, and fit your design exactly. Now the reason why each post after the first one is grayed out like this is because this is a convention of using a looper. Remember what we said about looper consumers. That first consumer you set up inside of a provider serves as a model for every other item output in that list. And we've already seen this taking place so far. Any change I make on this first item will be reflected on every item throughout the rest of the list. So if I adjust this padding, we'll see that every item's padding gets adjusted, or I can take it back and tweak anything else I want. All right, so now that we've gotten that final bit of looper information out of the way, let's actually start breaking down the design here. And I'm just going to walk you through some of the design decisions I made while creating these presets, and just kind of keep them in mind when using them on your own, and maybe use them for your own patterns moving forward based on your own needs. So on the row here, you'll see that for our responsive layout, I'm actually not using a hard-coded column layout. I'm not using 50/50 or 1/3, 2/3. I'm using this custom value input here. Now for these rows, when you output a custom value for these inputs, that value gets applied as a flex basis value on the column. And I won't really get into the technicalities of that right now, but it does allow us to do some really cool stuff. And in this particular use case, it allows us to achieve what I like to call sort of an auto-responsive layout. I've actually got some other videos about these auto-responsive layouts here on our YouTube channel, so definitely make sure to check those out when you have a chance. But at their core, why I use this pattern is because I, as a designer, am not sure where you're going to drop this particular post element into your design. For example, if you put this in a large full width section, you would have plenty of space for maybe a 4-column design to work. However, if you put it on a very skinny sidebar, all of that content is going to get really scrunched. So when we use this technique, what it's effectively doing is saying these columns should not be any smaller than the value present in this input. And what that effectively means is the length that you're seeing right here from the edge of this post to here is that 22M value. And as I resize my browser down, you'll notice that eventually once it hits the edge of the container, everything falls down into a 1-column layout because it shouldn't be any smaller than 22Ms when it still has space to move. But now the really cool thing is that if I keep going down, you'll notice that eventually it will start shrinking once there's absolutely no more space for items to break to a new line. So I just really like using this technique because it allows me to effectively not have to think too much about where I want my columns to break or anything to work. I just kind of put my content and it fits that space the best way it knows how to. I'm going to go back up to my outline here, and you'll see directly inside of our post element, which is our column, I've got 2 items here. One is a figure and one is an article. So this is kind of a new feature of this release as well, but we've introduced a new generic layout element, which we're calling a div element. It's just a general purpose item you can use instead of having to always output a row, column, or grid cell combination when working on layouts. And even though it's called a div, you can actually change the base tag of it if you need to. And in fact, all of our layout elements, from columns to rows to sections, can have their base tag be adjusted now. For example, this post element, which is my column, I've set its tag to an anchor tag. And then for that anchor tag value, I've got some dynamic content here with the permalink to that post. Now we've got other videos on dynamic content, but just remember that these strings are effectively pulling through information about this item that we've already pulled through with our query from our provider. So this will link off to this particular post in our list. And also remember that you don't have to remember these dynamic content strings. I could simply click on this dynamic content icon anywhere it's present. That will open up our little pop-up, and we could search for permalink, add it in, and now I have a linked post linking off to my individual asset. One final thing to note on this column, I do have its internal flexbox layout turned on. It's laid out in a column, meaning that its direct children will be laid out top to bottom. And horizontally, I'm stretching everything across the x-axis there. And then vertically, I'm just aligning everything to the top. So nothing super special there. And then of course, we can always come up to our row and play around with the distribution of some of these items. For example, if I wanted these posts to be aligned to the start of my row, the end of my row, have some space between. There's lots of different ways we can play around with these layouts since all of this stuff is powered by Flexbox. So back to our generic div element here, which we've renamed to figure. And I've done that because this is housing my featured image for the post. Now I've done some stuff on this div where I have hidden the overflow for it, and that's because I have a border radius applied here, and I want that to clip the edges of my image if I turn that on. So for example, if I made this very obvious, you'll see how that's clipping the borders of the image there since our overflow is hidden. Additionally, I've set a hard height on this div of 44 VH. That basically means 44% of the height of the screen. I've also given it a maximum and minimum value. This effectively gives kind of a lock system where this div will slightly grow and shrink based on the screen that's viewing it, but it does have a min and max, keeping it from getting too large or too small. Now the reason why I did that is because I knew that the image inside of this div, I didn't want it to be growing, or if we had different sized images, kind of throwing off the feel for all of our posts being shown up in a row. So the image inside of that div, I've got its width and height to 100%. That means it's just spanning to fill that whole container. And then we have this new feature here for images where we can change how the object fit position works. And by default, this would be set to fill. And you'll see, since our image is 100% width and height, it's kind of getting scrunched inside that div. But if I set this to cover, we get a really nice effect where it's filling up that div and just the edges are moving off the side if there's no room for them. And again, this was all done to give a uniform appearance, so each of these images have the same height. You could easily take the height off of that parent div and have natural images with their natural aspect ratio working for you. Next, we've got our article div, which again is a div element that we've set its tag to article because we're housing most of our content here. And the one big thing to keep in mind with this particular setup is how we're using this flex positioning. I've set the flex grow to 1 here, and you'll remember that on the post, we had the Flexbox layout set to column, so things are moving vertically in here. And since I have the flex grow set to 1 on this div, it will allow it to grow and fill all the space if an image is not set. And this was important just because I wanted to explore this concept for this particular design. So in this recent post element, if a featured image is not set on that post, this article div will expand to fill the entire item, and so you still get a nice framing of where that post lives, even though that image is not present anymore within this post. Continuing on with our content, we basically just have a headline here that's pulling through our title with dynamic content. We have a text element pulling through an excerpt with dynamic content. And the cool thing with this dynamic content excerpt is we can change the length of the words coming through for that excerpt. So if you wanted to have a shorter excerpt, we could change that to 10 or bring it back to 20 and get it exactly how you want. Or keep in mind, since these are individual elements, and let's say you didn't want an excerpt at all on this recent post, we could simply delete that, and we've got a much simpler setup going on now. I'm going to bring my excerpt back here, and then finally you'll see that we've got one more headline element with the text pulling through the display name of the author that wrote that post. Now you might be wondering how we are hiding this figure here whenever an image is not set. And that is using a new feature that we've released in this release cycle as well. It's our element conditions, and you can effectively apply these to any element in your layout. And for this particular element, I've set up a condition to say, only output this figure if a featured image is set. So that means if there's no featured image on the post, it won't output that markup, because if there wasn't a featured image but we still put the markup out, we would just have a broken image tag, and we don't want that. So that's what's allowing us to get this variable output that kind of adjusts based on what our users are giving us on the back end. Now, one final little thing I want to talk about on this particular element is how these interactions are working. You'll notice when I hover anywhere over this column, we've got this kind of animation up, and that's using our new effect module, which is present on every element. And we've got a great video out right now that you can watch on that goes really into detail on kind of just how everything works there. So you'll see that when I hover over this post, we're just translating up 5 ems. But I also want you to notice that when I hover anywhere inside this post, you see this little graphic flip here on my headline. And that's just a little touch I added to explore this concept that we have on any of our layout elements called link child interactions. And what this does is it allows you to say, hey, when I hover on this parent item, maybe I want something within to change based on that hover. For example, you'll also notice when I hover over this item that the text changes from black to orange for our title here. And this is all happening because of our link child interactions option here. Now, if I turn this off, you'll see that we still get the motion up of the post, but our title didn't change color until we hovered over it, and our author will not flip until we hover over it. So let me turn this back on, and let's see what happens if I turn off effects. You'll notice that the little author icon next to the name will not flip anymore. So effects are kind of our all-encompassing word for things like transforms, filters, opacity. Anything that's using one of those effects is handled by this. So now that we've got this turned off, that flipping of the icon doesn't happen anymore until I hover directly over that item. But we can chain it from the parent with this turned on. Additionally, I could turn off this title text color changing until I hover on it. Notice that when this is on, the color will change. And when this is off, the color stays black, but once I hover over that text, it then turns orange. So you can use these in lots of creative ways and combinations to get all sorts of different permutations of this design. And it really just comes down to personal preference and how you want things to work. So that is kind of a basic rundown of the minimal post variant with this element. All right, so now let's take a moment to take a look at another post example we've gotten here. I'm going to bring in the list style now. Now, this is a design I came up with that is really intended to be used in a smaller content area. Think like a sidebar, or maybe if you've got lots of columns in a row and you just have a reduced amount of width to work with. So if I jump down here and I give this a smaller max width, you can kind of see the intended design come together here. Now keep in mind, once again, this is a row element, so that's why we see the red observer here. And if I inspect it, we see we've got our recent post type bringing in our most recent post with our count set to 5. Now this first post item is just the column inside that row. And you can see on its customized settings that the consumer is turned on, and that's how we're getting the output. The cool thing about the setup like this is even though we've got this in a row and we're using a single column layout for every breakpoint here, we could actually do something where if we had a larger width to work with, we could come up here and say, make this a 2-column layout. And now you'll see how that row is laying out in 2 columns, and we can put these posts side by side if we wanted. So while this design is kind of intended for a sidebar, you could use it in a wider content area and then adjust it responsively so that it goes down to 1 column at another point there. I'm going to bring this max width back in. And now let's talk about the internals of our post element here. So you can see that inside we've got 2 more of our div elements. And again, I've labeled them figure and article. I've tended in these examples to label these with the element tag I'm giving them just to help with semantics a little bit more. Now, before we dive into these elements, I also want to take note that on this post here, we've got, of course, our link turned on via our tag, our anchor tag. We've got the permalink here. And then I do have its flexbox layout turned on. So it's set to row. That's what's laying out this figure and this content horizontally here. And then on that horizontal alignment, we're just setting it to the start. And then vertically, we are centering everything. And that's how we're getting like our title here kind of centered on this image for this post that only has 1 line of text. All right, so let's jump back to our outline and inspect our figure. So again, this is a div element, but we've set our tag to use the figure tag. I'm using my overflow hidden settings again because I've got some border radius here that we're using to clip that image that we can adjust as we see fit. We've got a little bit of margin that's bumping the text away from the image here. And then inside this div, I've got Flexbox turned on, and basically I'm just centering the content within. And really what this is for is our conditional content. You'll notice that on my post here without a featured image, instead of just removing this figure entirely, like we did on the previous post example, you can also explore ideas like this. So on this post where I don't have a featured image, I didn't remove this div, I simply replaced the image with an icon instead. So that's a cool idea to explore as well. Maybe you don't want to just completely omit some markup, but rather have it conditionally show different bits of output based on something going on with that post. For the dimensions of this element, I've got its flex positioning set to no shrink, and this just ensures that that image won't get scrunched based on this text pushing against it. And then we've got a hard width and height here that you can, of course, adjust as you see fit if you want to make some adjustments with how this works. So very fun, very flexible to work with, and just a lot of possibilities to play around with here. We've, of course, also got the background color that you're seeing here, and you'll notice that on the front end, for example, you would see this purple color behind this arrow. But when we've got an image, that, of course, is going to take over here. So let's inspect this image really quick. You'll see once again we're using our 100% width and height just to make our image span the entire dimensions of its parent container. Got some simple alt text here. Our image is set with dynamic content, and of course we're doing our object fit set to cover again so that we don't get our scrunched image. We get that nice full effect. As for the icon, if you wanted to see that or adjust it, we can of course see any of our elements we're working with here in the document outline, and I could inspect this and go through its properties. So now let's say if I wanted this icon to be a little bit larger, I could adjust that and we can see how that works. However, another thing you might want to do occasionally is use the preview manager's element conditions ignore setting. And when this is on, it effectively turns off any conditions being applied to any elements here in the preview. So I could directly inspect things while I'm working on them and move back and forth. And then once we want to see how everything will be actually working on the front end, we turn this back off, and then we'll see it functioning like normal again. So just keep that in mind. It's a little workflow thing to be aware of when working with these conditional statements. I didn't mention it earlier, but of course the image here is the element that has the condition saying if a featured image is set, output the image. And then my icon here, if I inspect it and go to its customized settings, we'll see that it says if the featured image is not set, we should output the icon. So that's how we're getting this variable output for a figure. Beyond that, we've got one more div element, which is set to an article tag. Its flex positioning is custom. It's growing to fill all available space. And beyond that, there's really nothing too special about this. We've really just got our headline element in here, which is using our primary text to output the title. And then, of course, we have our subheadline text, which is outputting a formatted date for us. You'll notice here as well, I don't think I talked about this on the last element, but we have our new color pickers here where you can adjust colors for everything within one color picker. And this is really nice because it just reduces some of the overhead in the workspace. But with this update where layout elements are linkable and we've really tried to bring effects to the forefront, and there's so many ways we can play around with our layouts now, pretty much all of our basic foundational elements like rows, columns, sections, text, headlines, images, any of the basic colors in those elements will typically have a base and an interaction color. So once you open this picker, you can adjust the base color, which is what we're seeing over there now, and then we can also adjust the interaction color, which would be on hover, what it's doing. Finally, for this text element, you'll notice that the transition on the color is happening instantly. We don't have a fading effect going on. And that is, of course, managed under our effects module. I've just gone to my transition control and set its duration to 0 milliseconds, which kills any sort of motion from the black to the purple that you'll see there. Now, one thing that's worth noting about these elements is that I've tried to set them up in such a way to where small adjustments can really make a big difference in how they work in your design. So for example, this element is not set up currently to have this whole block of content wrap beneath this image, for instance, if it got too small. You'll notice if I drag my browser down and this starts getting smaller, the text just keeps wrapping, but that image always stays to the left there. However, if you wanted to adjust this, we could inspect our main column here, which is containing those two elements. And you'll see that it wasn't wrapping because its flexbox layout was set to not wrap. So if we turn on this control, and then I shrink my browser down to the point where it starts wrapping, you'll see that we could use this in such a way to where that text will automatically go beneath the image when it runs out of space. Now, the way that value is set up and working is, again, kind of one of these auto-responsive techniques that I like to use a lot when I'm working on designs. If I inspect the article element here, holding our text, and inspect the flex control, you'll see that its flex basis is set to 12 ems. So again, you can think of this as kind of the floor where this flexbox layout will say, this text should always be at least 12 ems wide, and if it can't be, I'll try and break to a new line if I need to. And that is how we are getting this effect. So right about here is where you see that 12 ems come into play and the text goes beneath the image. Now, you'll notice, of course, that our text is kind of right up against the image here up top. So if I were to do something like this, I would personally probably go down to my padding here, maybe unlink this, and give it a simple value top and bottom. So that padding is always there on the article now. And then when this breaks, of course, we'll have a little bit of spacing between our text and our image, but we have something that is a little more responsive if you do need that, even though it's kind of set up to really not need that. All right, so just a minor side note there that hopefully gets your wheels turning a little bit and just seeing how flexible you can be with these elements, just making minor adjustments to how they're set up. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's get rid of that element, and we're going to go to our last post element, which is our tiles element. Now that we've talked about a lot of this, for each of the previous elements, you're probably starting to understand some of the patterns we're using here. Our post element is a row again. We've of course got the provider turned on, and I've set this count to 3 so that we can achieve this kind of cool layout here, which I'll explain in a moment. And then next, we've got our post element. Now, with the way this element is laid out with its markup, when you inspect in here, the first thing you'll click on is this article element. So you'll always need to go up to the post if you need to make an adjustment on here. And you can see that our post is where we're starting our looper consumer based on the icon and the observer there. I've of course got my tag here set to an anchor. I've got my permalink in the link control here. I've got my overflow set to hidden again. And I'm using that for my border radius, which again, if we made it really obvious, we'd see how that gets cut off there. Finally, I've got just a little bit of box shadow happening here for us to add some depth to the design. And then I'm doing my trick again where I'm setting a height for this overall element on this column. And then I've given it sort of a minimum and maximum value that will keep it contained without getting too tall or too small as my screen grows and shrinks responsively. And again, this is done primarily to give us a uniform look in our layout, because since in this design, the image is used as kind of a background asset, it's just floating behind the text, that image isn't going to give us any of our dimensions to work with. So we need to hard code something here to give that box a sense of space that it needs. Finally, as just a little bit of a design flourish, I've got my 2 particles turned on for this column because we've added particles to all of the layout elements again in this release. So that's a really nice addition, and it's very subtle and it's a little bit hidden by the observer here, but you can see when we hover over this column, we get these 2 particles kind of appearing in the top corner here, almost like a little arrow. And actually, if I collapse my interface here, you'll see that a little bit better. So the cool thing is, if that's something you would prefer to maybe not have, you can simply turn these off. And you'll notice when we hover, we just get the kind of scaling and fading effect going on. So let's talk about the internals of this post element here, which is basically this article div where we have our div element set up again. You're kind of seeing these patterns emerge. I've got the tag set to article since we've got our content here. And this is where I've got my background set. So you'll notice that the base background is set to use this kind of slightly transparent black background. And then on hover, it just gives a little bit more opacity so that we get that fading effect where the image comes into focus as we hover on top of it. I've set my div to be 100% width and height of the parent it's in, that column. And then I'm using flexbox positioning inside this div to lay out my text content. So you'll see it's set up in a column placement, so that's why my text is flowing from top to bottom. And I've just aligned it to the start both horizontally and vertically. Now, the way that I'm spacing out this text in here is that you'll notice on my headline here, I've got a margin top of auto. Now, top margins of auto or bottom margins of auto won't typically space things out like this, but it will work if we have a parent using flexbox positioning. So that's just a nice little tip to keep in mind that I'll use a lot in my designs. We've got some padding here on this div just to space everything out. And then if I go back to the top here, you'll see that we've got 3 elements inside here. We've got our publish date, which again is just some text with a formatted date. If I inspect that, you'll see what we've got here. And that text does have a little bit of a color change on hover. My title is of course set to show the title dynamically with our dynamic content. Got some font sizing changes and some colors, nothing too crazy there. But then you'll notice that we've got our figure as a div inside this article. And you'll see when I hover over both, they appear to be taking up the same amount of space. And this is a really cool trick that I wanted to highlight here and show you all how to do in your own designs. So the div element, one thing that's really fun about it is we wanted to kind of use it as a way to expose some more common features of CSS that we can't really add to our other standard elements like buttons and text for various reasons. So one thing you can do with the div is actually adjust its position from static to relative to absolute or fixed. Now, if you know a little bit about CSS, you'll know that absolute positioning effectively means that this div will be taken out of the document flow, and then we can position it relative to its nearest parent that's using relative positioning, which in this case is our column. So basically all I've done here to get this image scaling effect is I've made my div have absolute positioning, and then I've put it to the edge of that parent by using 0 pixels as the value all the way around. You'll see if I were to adjust these, let's say I did my top as 50, you'll see how that div starts moving away from the edge, just very obviously playing around with those values. So you could come in here and play around with maybe moving that div and maybe giving it a slight offset. There's a lot of fun things we can play around with here, but I wanted it personally to sit to the very edge because remember on our parent here, for our post, we have our overflow hidden. Now what I'm doing with this figure element here is you'll see that on hover, we're scaling it up just a little bit. And that scaling effect is what's giving us that sense of the image growing when we move our mouse over it here in the live preview. So without that overflow hidden on the parent, you would see the image actually grow beyond the bounds of this column. But since we're hiding it and clipping all of that excess space off, we just kind of get this really cool scaling effect. And then when paired with the subtle background change and some text changes, we just get a really nice subtle element that focuses on imagery, but also allows us to just get a really clean look for our text in there. Now, much like our other elements, my figure here is where I've got a condition set up. I'm saying if there's a featured image, then allow this figure to be output. So if you don't have a featured image, what you effectively get is just a black post. And that's just a nice general purpose fallback for situations where an image is not being output. The final bit of CSS that I'm using to get this whole technique working is I've got my z-index set to -1, which when paired with my z-index on a post of being 1, this allows me to push the figure behind all of the content so it doesn't cover it up. For example, If this was a little bit higher, you'll notice that it sits on top of my content now. But with -1, I can push it behind and it will never get in the way of my text or my published date or anything like that. So one final note on this layout and how I'm getting these 2 columns up top side by side and my 1 down below. You'll notice that on my row here, I'm using my auto-responsive layout again. So these values here can be adjusted as you see fit for your design, but this is just kind of a sensible default I liked when working on it. And again, what that means is these columns should never be less than 28 ems when they're resizing. So you'll see that eventually they will break and go full width just on their own. They're not dependent on a breakpoint. But the cool thing here is since I'm using this count of 3, if I set this layout option to grow, what that does is it allows these cells, if there is space to the side here, to grow and fill all of that space. You'll notice that if I turn this off, we get everything filling up the same amount of space, and then we can really see the effect of this alignment control taking place now. So we could turn that off and play around with repositioning our columns in a different way here inside of that row. And there's always lots of fun and different ways to play around with those values based on how we set our horizontal alignment. So I'm just going to bring this back to grow. And of course, if you knew that you always wanted to have 4 posts outputting and you didn't really care about getting this kind of different look here, we can come to our provider, adjust our count, and then we've got 4 posts.